It's sort of the secret weapon. Like, if nothing else is working, you're almost guaranteed.
I've heard guys call that stretch of the river the secret river because of how many people don't fish it.
And right when he's approaching it in that last few inches, one strip and boom.
I always like getting to see new places. That's one of the benefits of getting to travel and go meet people and talk to people.
Yeah.
Which brings me to our guest of this episode, and that is Keith Reeves. Keith, you may know him as Ozark Mountain Fly on his social media. You may know him for his hyper-realistic flies that he ties, incredible patterns. I mean, some of the stuff you tie and put together, it looks like jewelry. Like, it's something that I'm like, man, I could put that on a necklace. Or, I could get you an anklet for Christmas, Kyle.
You know, my wife.
I know you've been wanting one.
My wife once said that if I made her earrings, she'd wear them. So I made her earrings, and she's never worn them.
She hasn't worn them.
No.
Oh man,
that's little flashing.
They're still sitting on her little jewelry tray in the bathroom.
That's fantastic.
She kept them though. So
they're
that's
probably
good.
too flashy. Honestly,
I think
they're
so.
a little bit fancy,
a little big, a little flashy.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, I'm excited to get to have you on this episode. And for someone like you, what I was thinking about for this episode is just to kind of frame it up. For someone like you who's able to tie very, very realistic flies, and you're an excellent tyer, so you can really tie whatever you want to. I wanted to come to you and let you boil down, like, for you, what are the most important flies you want to have in your box for smallmouth as we head into the summer and the spring, late spring, and just kind of let you expand upon that, because for a lot of people who fish, it's like, gosh, there's so many options, and you hear all these different podcasts and YouTube videos and people fishing whatever, and it's like, I just need, help me boil it down. Like,
Sure.
Give me 3 to 5, whatever, just a basic amount of flies that I need to have in my box that I can go out and be successful in the Ozarks.
Well, I think I feel like I need to preface that by saying the flies that I would recommend are flies that have worked for me in the scenarios that I fish.
Sure.
And a majority of the waters that I fish are small creeks like the one we're on.
Yeah.
Mainly wade fishing. I do float a couple times a summer. But, we're talking about small tributaries to some of the bigger creeks, really clear low water scenarios. So I've only recently ventured into fishing some of the bigger waters that we have, and I'm definitely still trying to figure that out. Streamer fishing is something I've gotten into over the last few years, and I love it. But my speaking will pertain mainly to the types of rivers I have experience on, and creeks more than rivers.
Yeah,
so
perfect.
I think the main thing is covering the different parts of the water column.
Yeah.
So before getting into a specific pattern, I think it's important to have a fly that will get down on the bottom, fish the bottom. It's important to have a slow sinking fly that can pick up some depth without going all the way to the bottom. It's important to have a fly that will hover just under the surface of the water, and it's important to have a top water in your box.
Okay.
So within that, covering those different parts of the water column, there's so many different patterns out there that you can use that are applicable for that.
Yeah. And we'll dive into those, and that's going to be, I think that's a perfect setup for the episode, because that's a good way to think about is breaking it up in those water columns, because that's important. And when you choose a fly, that's probably the first thing you need to think about is, where are the fish? What are they looking for? How can I play to that scenario?
Right.
Before we get too deep into that topic and diving into that rabbit hole, which we'll spend all of our time on, or most of our time on, talk me through just a little bit about you. Like, when did you start getting into fishing? Where did you grow up? And kind of what was your exposure to fishing to the point that, like, it got you excited enough to want to keep doing it and then grow on that to tying and down the road?
Sure. So I am 39 years old, and when I was 12 or 13, my family started a family reunion of the sorts, and we would go to the Elk River in Missouri to do a camping trip and a float trip. It wasn't about fishing, because really now there are more fishermen in my family, but back in those days, no one fished. We were all hunters,
Okay.
I've grown up in the outdoors, and we would swim in the creeks and hang out. But I would honestly say going on this trip to the Elk River sort of got the whole family into fishing, because you can go and float that river and just see all of these fish in the water. And so after going for a couple of years, I started like, man, I'd like to catch those.
Yeah.
And it was so funny, because some of the fish that we were seeing before knowing at that point, like what even was in the rivers, we were like, oh, they're brown trout.
Yeah.
That's a rainbow trout. And there were no trout
Just
in the
totally
Elk River.
misidentified.
Oh, yeah. It was all the different species of fish that had color. And if it had any red, I mean, it was a rainbow trout, you know. So I guess around 12 or 13, started trying to catch them. And then not so much fishing on those rivers, but I grew up in Fort Smith, Arkansas, had Lee Creek and the Mulberry River in my backyard, and going to the elk inspired me to want to get better at catching fish in a creek. And so Lee Creek is really where my love of fishing, my love of smallmouth, and my beginnings of learning how to catch them started. My uncle had a cabin on Old Cove City Road when I was a kid, and that was like the highlight of our winters and summers, is going to the cabin and riding the four-wheelers down to the creek and hanging out. But started out with a spinning rod and using, I think maybe Yum was the first, the crawdad that Yum makes, and had a fair amount of success with that. And as time went on, someone introduced me to the Zoom Ultra Vibe Speed Craw.
Okay.
On a Texas rig with a number 1 offset shank worm hook and a 1/16 ounce bullet weight. And that significantly increased my catch rate. So much that it may have stunted my ability to learn to fish other things, because I caught so many with that.
Yeah.
I didn't need to fish anything else.
So consistent. You're like, why would I change?
So, really, without running the years right at the moment, starting around when I was 12, 15, 20 years of fishing with a spinning rod, and then started meeting people that fly fished and seeing them on, I guess YouTube a little bit, or meeting some of these guys, or just driving by and seeing them. It looked super interesting to me. So I guess about 9 years ago, we moved into a new house, and when I bought the house, there was a man down the street casting a fly rod. And I knew immediately, like, I want to go talk to that guy.
Yeah.
And so once we got moved in and settled, I just went down and introduced myself. His name's Mac Wilson. And Mac is a very accomplished tyer. He's retired, but he sort of took me under his wing and helped me get a better handle on casting. Definitely is the one who showed me how to tie flies. And I've had just a lot of different mentors along the way. Johnny Sane is a good friend of mine that I worked for back in college, and Johnny's actually the first person who ever took me smallmouth fishing with a fly rod.
Okay.
And was the first one to say, hey, you're using trout flies and trout rods to try to catch smallmouth, and sort of introduced me to heavier rods, heavier lines and leaders, and bigger flies. And so I try to learn something from anyone who will ever teach me, but definitely Johnny, and then Mac Wilson. Mac, I kind of joke around, is like my Mr. Miyagi of fly fishing. But it's so cool, and he lives down the street, so we, we'll sometimes run to the store and end up in an hour-long conversation because we ran into the other one out at the curb. But
yeah.
And then later in the tying and fishing, ended up meeting Dwayne Hayda and getting to know him, and obviously learned a ton from fishing with him and talking with him. But there have been a lot of guys. I know you guys have had Ryan Walker on the show before. Ryan and I have met a few times. We haven't had a chance to fish yet, but he's always been super cool with answering questions via text or social media. And we actually had lined out. I was going to go fish with him, and then the rain, the water blew it out. But so about 9 years I've been into fly fishing now, and I won't say that I lost interest in fishing with the spinning rod. It's just one of those things where when life happened, I slowed down a little bit and turned my focus more to hunting. Yeah. Bow hunting specifically, I love that. But when I got into fly fishing for smallmouth, it completely rekindled the flame of fly fishing and fishing in general. And I would say I love it even more than I did back then now.
Yeah.
So
I love it.
that's it.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned some people who there's a lot to learn from those people. Dwayne, we've had on the podcast too, and if you guys haven't heard that, I'd say make sure you go back and listen to Dwayne's episode very early on. I don't even remember what number.
Still
episode.
one of our best.
Still one of my favorites we've done. But yeah, a lot to learn out there. So how long have you been tying flies then? And then at what point did you want to take fly tying to like the next level? Because you can, start tying flies and like I tie flies, but I am by no means proficient and able to do all the patterns that you would be able to do. What point were you like, I like this enough to want to take this to the next level?
This is a rough estimate, but I really think when I got into fly fishing heavily is when I started tying. So I'm going to say 9 years.
Okay.
About 9 years now. Maybe a couple less, no more than 9. But it came out of necessity because I was going and buying flies at the shop, which I encourage, because that's what those are there for, and the stores definitely need the support of fly fishermen. You lose a lot of flies, and especially coming out of spinning rod fishing with an ultra vibe speed craw, bottom flies and weighted flies were what I started on in fly fishing. And of course, if you're going to fish weighted flies and fish on the bottom, you're going to get hung, you're going to break off, you're going to lose them. So to start with, it was just simply to save money because I could tie them for less than I could buy a new one. We say that, and then you spend $500 in materials to tie flies.
Yeah. But you feel better about it.
Oh, you do, for sure.
You're like, matters for something.
I could make 100 of these.
Will you? Probably not. So I started that, and then with the crawdad, with that being what I was comfortable fishing, stumbled across the Hayda Creek crawler.
Yeah.
And started tying that fly, and had success with it. It was one of my favorite ones to fish, and had posted a picture of it on I think the Trout and Smallmouth Hunters of the Ozarks was the Facebook page, and someone tagged. It's Dwayne Hayda's pattern, by the way. I don't know if I said that already, but the Hayda Creek crawler. Someone tagged Dwayne in the post, and he commented on it, just said something kind about the tie. And I thought that was really cool because I hadn't met him, hadn't talked to him at that point, but just interacting with someone who's done a lot for fly fishing in Arkansas and smallmouth bass specifically, and someone who is an artist himself, it was cool for him to be like, hey, that looks nice. And so I sent him some flies just like as a complimentary, and ended up getting invited the next year. We do a thing called the Smallmouth Tour, and I think they did it a year before I came along.
Okay.
But he invited me along to instruct, because I'm a teacher, like my day job is a teacher, and he invited me to help teach the attendees of the Smallmouth Tour how to tie that fly.
Okay.
Specifically the Hayda Creek crawler. So my first year coming along with them, my role was literally, they would do kind of what I mentioned, bottom, a little off the bottom, middle, water column, top. I was the creek crawler guy. And so that evolved into eventually being one of the instructors when we go out on day 2 of our tour stops to fish the river, working with people and showing them how to catch smallmouth and do that. But I think just through tying that and then continuing to see and hear what other people were using and wanting to figure out what all I could tie, it's an addiction like anything else. You tie 1, 2, 3. I think I tied the creek crawler, a woolly booger, and a craft fur clouser were my first 3 flies that I ever tied, and really fished those for 2 or 3 years before venturing into anything else. And the amount of creek crawlers I tied and the detail required to tie those, I think, those are so intense to tie. It's like if you can tie one of those, it seems like everything else is and they're still challenging flies, but definitely the amount of materials and the detail in that set me up to where, I can watch a YouTube video or jump on somebody's Instagram live or Facebook live and do tie alongs. So, but that's just really repetition and doing it over and over again and go into the water and seeing what's swimming that I don't have in my box and trying to come up with something that looks like it. So,
yeah. So you started with one of the hardest things to tie, and you feel like it sets you up to be able to tie these other more challenging patterns now that you've kind of got that baseline knowledge.
And I wish that I would have brought it. I still have the first creek crawler I tied.
Do you really?
I do. I did not. I didn't fish with it.
How does it compare to what you tie
it's
now?
Ugly.
It
looks like someone put a handful of glue and a bunch of materials in their hand and wrapped
Stuck
it around
to
the
a
hook
hook.
and squeezed it.
Yeah.
And so it's really cool to see the evolution of that. But I still have it. I've got a painting that Dwayne did, a smallmouth print above my fly tying desk, and I still have that original creek crawler hanging in the corner there, the painting.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, let's dive in. So you've mentioned now, and I think I'm going to kind of follow the direction that you've set of breaking down the water column. And as it relates to, if we go through that water column, let's just pick like maybe one fly per water column and kind of break that down of like, this is probably my most proficient fly to approach that portion of the stream.
Okay.
So if we start and you're getting out on the creeks this summer and you're seeing things, I guess maybe I'll start actually before we go there is like, how are you picking apart and saying like, okay, well, I'm going to target this part of the water column on this day versus, hitting top water or the bottom? How are you kind of deciphering what to start with?
For me, it's really just trial and error, and this may be an incorrect way to fish, but I usually always go for the bottom first.
Okay.
And I think that is, again, because my experience of fishing is predominantly fishing weighted flies on the bottom. And so I will start typically with a Craffer Clouser that looks like a dusky striped shiner or a cardinal shiner, creek chub, stone roller minnow.
Some little bait fish.
Some
that's just
small bait
right
fish.
under the current,
Yes.
right at the bottom. Okay.
And I guess I like the feel of connecting with the bottom and feeling it bounce along and then knowing and being able to distinguish the difference between that's a rock or that's a strike of a fish. And so I'll typically start on the bottom. If I don't pick up fish, then I will graduate. And this, it kind of mixes a little bit because I've only been fishing with sinking and intermediate lines for maybe 3 years now.
Okay.
So everything in the beginning was on a floating line fishing, and I just sort of adapted flies to still cover the different parts of the water column using different types and amounts of weight. But just have it, the bottom is where I typically start. And if I'm not catching anything there, I will throw on, I always carry, if I'm in a boat, if I'm wading, I take one rod, multiple spools. But if I'm in a boat, I'm going to have two rods. I'm going to have one that has a floating line and one that has a sinking tip at least. And so I will probably, if the clouser's not picking up, throw on either a double deceiver or also like to fish. I'm a big fan of the feather game changers.
Okay.
That's one of the flies I keep in my box just because they look so realistic when they swim. Yes, they're a pain to tie. They take a long time to tie, and it really hurts when you lose one. But I love the visual of watching a fish come up and hit that streamer. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't go to the complete opposite top water, but I'll go to the bottom first, and then if not the bottom, fish something that's just going to get down a little bit below the surface, and just kind of go back and forth. I mean, I typically will, unless I start catching fish immediately, will cycle through 5, 6, 7 flies.
Okay.
And sometimes it's fishing one fly and trying that same fly in a different color before I switch. Sometimes it's going straight from a clouser to a craft fur. I love craft fur. It's one of the most lifelike materials in the water. It's not as durable as bucktail, and it fouls a lot. But when you get it in the water, to me, craft fur just looks like a bait fish swimming in the water. And so I'll use either a keel weighted craft fur bait fish or one that's kind of rigged like a belly dragger, where you take 2 tungsten beads and some beading wire and put it on the bottom so that it rides hook up, and you get that sinking thing like a clouser, but the weight is distributed in the middle of it so it doesn't dive head first. It sort of settles parallel.
What's
and then
a keel weighted?
Keel weighted, if I give you a definition, I'm going to butcher it, but it basically is just basically weighting the fly so that it rides hook up.
Okay.
So you're flipping it upside down and putting weight on it so the belly of the fly drags the bottom.
Got it.
So it would be like the opposite of a bead head, where
Yes,
the weight would be
100%.
in the front. Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So,
Okay. So I'm kind of surprised when you say starting with working the bottom. I would have thought the first thing you said was like, all right, I'm throwing the creek crawler.
Right.
But you mentioned a couple bait fish.
And that has been an evolution for me. I think there are rivers and creeks that the creek crawler might be all I fish all day long. I guess because of the evolution and getting into streamer fishing, maybe the clouser is like a crossover. I don't really know where that happened, but I can say the answer would have been different just a couple of years ago.
Sure.
And maybe that still comes from I lose a lot of creek crawlers. I mean, there's a method and a technique to it, and I've definitely gotten better at keeping it ticking along the bottom without breaking off and losing it. But, if I tie 4 and take 4 to the river, I'm almost definitely going to lose 4 while I'm there.
Really?
So
it's not fun to lose them like that.
No. And I think they're a wonderful fly in pressured water. I've had stories of friends who have, thrown everything in the box at pressured fish and gotten no reaction, and then tied on a creek crawler and immediately, hit. And so I also, in saying that my methods and styles of fishing may have evolved a little, would also say that it's sort of the secret weapon. Like if nothing else is working, you're almost guaranteed. So maybe it's more of an exploratory thing where I'm wanting to try and get proficient fishing other types of flies, that it isn't my first one now, as to where maybe a couple of years ago that would have been my answer.
It would have been.
And it's a blast. Sight fishing, fish that you can see, tossing it 7 or 8 feet in front of them and just letting it sit there and watching them come up to it. It's super exciting.
Yeah.
For sure.
So what's the key then, if it's not fly dependent, or maybe you'll say it is, but if you're working the bottom, what are you looking for? What are you feeling for? Because I know a lot of the times if you are working the bottom, you're not always going to be able to sight fish. Like on a day like today, we've just had some rain, so the water behind us, it's not crystal clear. You've got a little bit of murkiness to it. So if you're fishing this, you can't see the bottom. You can't see what your fly is doing.
Right.
So talk me through, as you're fishing that, what are you really looking for and feeling for as you're fishing the bottom? So
I like the heads of the pools and the tail outs. I love to cast in across right where the riffles are running into the pool, preferably in an area where there's enough current that the current does the work for me. And so it's not so much working the fly as it's just keeping it from getting stuck on the bottom, but letting the current do the work. Because, the fish oftentimes hang out there. I find in anything that I say, obviously there are people that fish that have had a different experience. So again, I want to be clear that I'm not saying this is the gospel, more so it's just it's been my experience.
That's why we love what we do, because we can sit down with 100 people who fly fish for smallmouth and hear 100 different techniques.
100%.
And if you can pick up bits and pieces from all of it and have that in the back of your mind as you're trying to fish these creeks, you're going to be a better fisherman.
100%.
And you'll end up having your own philosophy to be like, I do this here,
this is why
and this
I do
there. And I took some of this from Keith and some of this from this guy. So
we hear you. Continue
definitely,
on. That's
everything
great.
I do is a collage of people that have taught me things. So I like to, what I was about to say a second ago is a lot of times in the mornings, I'll find them more in the heads of pools.
Okay.
And I don't know why, but maybe it's the low light and the fish being able to look up and see things and they're waiting right there. But I've had more success in the mornings fishing the heads of pools and in the evenings at the tail outs of the pools.
Okay.
And then also in bigger water systems like on the upper Illinois River or the Ouachita River, honestly also finding them in the middle of the deep pools, because a lot of those have smallmouth that come up out of the lake and come up the river. And so they're yes, they hang out and feed in those other places, but they also like the deep holes as well. And so start out at the head of the pool, get several drifts through there, see if I can pick anything up, and then work my way into the deep part of the pool. And all I'm feeling for or watching, I'm watching the tip of my fly line to see if it moves opposite of the direction of the current or any little subtle thing.
Yeah.
And I always set the hook regardless, just because, it's better to set the hook or to miss it than have not tried at all.
Yeah. Doesn't cost you anything to go ahead and set it.
Right.
As long as you're not doing a trout set.
You just dropped a massive pro tip too. Do you mind explaining that process of watching the end of your line? Because once I figured that out, when it came to fishing these small Ozark streams, I went from only catching rocks or thinking I was only catching rocks to actually catching fish.
Right.
Because I just wasn't setting on like actual bites, actual hookups.
Sure.
So you just give like a 30-second how to do that, because that is pro level how to catch fish these streams.
I just, cast it out, make sure your line's bended so that you have contact, always staying in contact.
45 degrees.
Across, yeah.
Across, yeah.
And letting it drift down. And as long as your fly line is straight, you can tell what the current's doing and you can tell what's natural. And even if you bump a rock, it's not necessarily going to take off in a direction. It might hesitate a little bit, but when that line just a quarter inch in one direction or the other, or goes down, of course you typically would feel it in that scenario.
Right.
I mean, there's a pretty good chance that you have a fish on there. So there's not a big secret to it other than just keeping tight to the fly, watching that line, doing everything you could do with your mend and your drift, if that's the style that you're fishing, to keep that in line, and watching for any unnatural movement and assume it's a fish, and strip set, and it's funny that you mentioned not trout setting, because in all of my 9 years of fly fishing, only last summer did I learn about trout setting versus strip setting. And I noticed I was losing a ton of fish. And I think it was a Kelly Gallup YouTube video that I watched, and he explained that when you set trout set or set up, that it's taking that hook and it's rocking it at an angle that can pull it right out of the fish's mouth. And that's if you're fishing a hook up fly. A lot of the streamers are hooked down, so there's just a lot there. But man, I will say the strip set, it's fun, and I've, over the course of last summer and what little I've gotten to fish this year, has made a huge difference in hookups and keeping them pinned in. Yeah. So
it's also too, and I've heard this from someone else, but it's essentially, if you think about the mechanics of it, you get so much more force and pressure and speed to setting the hook versus a trout set. Because a trout set, you're putting so much of that resistance in the rod and up above you, versus when you're pulling straight back on a strip set, all of that energy is like straight to the line, versus letting a lot of that inertia and energy go into your rod.
100%.
So you end up, I think, getting a lot more hook sets.
And, if you raise the rod up like you would if you're setting the hook on a trout, you hook into a smallmouth and then it jumps out of the water, you have to pull that slack out of the line and adjust your arm way back to keep it. I mean, I've lost some great fish to having plenty of contact, but I had the rod straight up in the air, or not straight up, but up, and they jump and
it's over.
It creates slack and they're gone.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I'm working from the head of the pool, through the pool to the tail out, keeping contact with the bottom, feeling a lot of times a bite will be like a tap-tap or a tap-tap-tap. It's not typically just one hit, but it's all by feel most of the time. Now, there are some creeks that we have that you can sight fish, and that's my favorite way to do it, because it's a combination of feeling and watching them, but just keeping tight contact with the fly and feeling those bumps, going through the hole. And then another tip that I would offer people is to basically, you want to take the water that you're going to fish and divide it up like pie slices. And not only are you casting at one angle and then retrieving it and then going over to another slice of the pie and doing that, so methodically you're covering all the water, not casting all the way across to the furthest point as well. you're working your way from left to right or right to left, but also starting shallower and towards yourself and taking bites into the water.
That's a good tip.
Because that one of the biggest things that has helped me is learning we think we know where the fish are holding. If we can't see them, it's a guess. And we may look like, oh, this is beautiful rock structure. They're all in that.
Yeah.
And you throw the line across to make it to the rocks, and you've laid your line over the top of a whole school of fish that are right here.
Yeah.
So I like to start a little bit smaller fly, a little bit, even if it's weighted, not something that makes a big commotion. Break the water into a pie shape and start, just at the first drop off on my side of the bank and kind of fish that.
A little bit closer.
See what happens, and then go a little bit further out. So my final casts are
The furthest.
the furthest.
Yeah.
Now, if I fished water well enough that my experience has been, okay, the fish are going to hold here, then of course that goes out the window and I'm just fishing to where I've typically caught fish. But approaching easily, and that comes from fishing shallow, clear water, low water, not wanting to spook fish where you're more stalking them and sneaking up on them in almost like you're hunting fish.
Yeah.
So you can never be too careful.
I've heard guys call that stretch of the river the secret river.
Okay.
Because of how many people don't fish it.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like a secret river within your river.
100%.
It's like, I don't know if it's just human tendency or if it's fishermen like all of us with a tiny bit of an ego. But your first cast is like, I'm hammering that thing across.
Oh, man.
I'm it is going
as far as I can. Because that is so much fun.
Yeah.
But the guys, like you're saying, who learn, well, on your side of the bank, pick that first little bit of water that's up close and then move across. How many fish get caught right there? It's the idea of it's a secret river. It's a river that doesn't get fished. It's so secret. People are all over it, but they don't fish it.
And
awesome.
it's also with that is just because the cast doesn't go where you intended it to go, how many times have you been like, oh, that was terrible, and just ripped it out of the water? Yeah. And again, I've done that, and upon lifting it out of the water, had a great fish chase it, you know? So fish the fly, unless it's just unreasonable, like it lands on the bank. When you cast out, fish it from wherever it is, because again, the fish, we think we know where they are.
Yeah.
We're not 100% sure. So it's better to fish it than risk spooking it just to throw to another location that you're hoping the fish might be.
That's good.
Yeah.
So
that is really good. I love the secret river because even
that's cool. I'd never heard that.
There's so much too where you're like, yes, I want to get that big hero cast all the way across and feel like I'm in a movie.
Yeah.
But then also too, to that point, how many times you're like, man, I'm out here, like I want to be in the water, so I'm going to go ahead and just jump in, start waiting. It's like, stand on the bank, stand back a little bit, go ahead and cast to that first stretch right in front of you. Don't feel like you have to go ahead and jump in, knee deep because you want to be in the water. Like there are fish right there potentially.
Totally.
And you got to kind of explore that out before you commit, dive in, and go swimming.
Now, I would say commit, dive in, go swimming, and hero cast if your water's super clear, it's low, you snuck up to the bank and you see a big old smallmouth, like, 3/4 of the way across, holding up behind a log or whatever. It's like cast that fish.
Cast, sure,
absolutely.
But not at him, right?
Right.
Yeah.
In
Like
front of him so we can
leave a
see
little,
it and-
leave a little space.
For sure.
That was something Dwayne, when teaching me how to fish the creek crawler. What I loved watching him do is if he saw a smallmouth cruising, he would cast about 8 feet in front of it, where it was guaranteed this fish was heading that direction, but not throwing it right on top of it to spook the fish. But then letting it sit motionless, not throwing it in and immediately starting to retrieve that. More so with those bigger fish that may be pressured, letting it sink and just waiting as long as it takes. And there were so many times on this particular trip that he and I went on where for what seemed like a full minute, that bass was 5-6 feet out and wasn't coming any closer. And the longer that we just let it sit there, and all the other little fish came up to inspect it first, it's sort of like not shooting the first doe you see in the rut, right?
Yeah.
Because the does are going to come out first, and the younger bucks and the wiser deer are going to hang back and wait. Eventually, in all of those scenarios, the big fish came up, and the technique that we use is right I mean, when they're within striking distance, because if you start stripping it or working that fly too soon, that can spook them and turn them off. But essentially waiting until the bass almost feels or looks like he feels like he's got it in the bag. And right when he's approaching it in that last few inches, one strip, just one, and boom. I mean, so many times they would just slam it and then it was on from there. But if not, a strip and a pause, a strip, pause, no specific pattern, but mixing it up, but just waiting.
Yeah.
The patience factor, because you can run a lot of nice fish off by throwing the fly in and working it too soon in that scenario. Streamer fishing, totally different. But specifically with the creek crawler and the sight fishing, and even one of the jigs that I use, same thing.
Okay. Gotcha.
So, yeah.
Very cool. Do you want to show before we move on to middle of the water column? I know you brought some flies here.
Yeah.
I think I've got this camera over here cropped in tight enough to be able to show some of these flies.
Okay.
I can hold your coffee here. Let's pull some of these guys out and just kind of show some of the examples you're talking about for the bottom of the water column.
All right. So bottom of the water column, I'm going to go with, of course, there's the Haida Creek crawler.
So there's the creek crawler.
That's the creek crawler. And that is one that I would throw. And if you want to just sit it over there so we don't have to put it back in the box, that's fine.
Yeah, I want to try to get that in the shot. I don't know.
So creek crawler is a big one. A Helgermite.
Kyle, what do you think about that fly right there?
I was about to say, it looks like I could put it on a plate and eat it.
Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah, that's amazing.
Just need some corn on the cob and potatoes.
I know.
We're good to go,
Just do a
right?
little boil.
Helgermite.
Oh man, this is a cool fly. This is one of my favorites that you tie, at least that you post and you show off.
Well, and I appreciate it. In all of my tying, there are two flies that I actually would consider flies that I came up with. And this is specifically the way that I tie it. There's dozens of Helgermite patterns, but I use a dragon tail to tie that, a mini Magnum dragon tail. And then I just tie MFC Sexy Floss. I individually, by hand, use a triple overhand knot and make a loop and just slide it up onto the tail and add those on there. So it gives me the movement of the tail and it looks articulated, but it's just one piece. And I've not seen any other Helgermites tied with a dragon tail.
Cool.
Someone may have.
Most of the Helgermites I've been known to fish are stiff. Like it's just a big, long hook.
Sure, right.
And then
right.
what feels like pipe cleaner or something that, to wrap around it, that is way more interesting to me than fishing something like that.
It's been a lot of fun, and it doesn't get fished often because of my confidence patterns, but when I've fished it, I've had success with it. And then my other bottom fly is going to be the PB&J jig, the peanut butter and jelly jig.
Okay.
So this is again, I mean, it's a marabou jig with rubber legs. There's a bunch of them out there with the tungsten bead, but and it also has some lead wire 030 wrapped around to get it heavy and down at the bottom. But this tends to get hung a little less than some of the other bottom flies because of the way the tungsten bead sets on the jig head.
Yeah.
And it's smaller. It's not huge. That's a size 6 MFC jig hook.
Okay.
So those three, along with, I guess, you told me to limit it. I just can't because I'll try so many. This is a craft fur bait fish.
Yeah.
And it's the one I mentioned that there's 2 tungsten beads inside of it.
Okay. Go ahead. Hold that up to the camera.
Yeah.
There.
So super lifelike in the water, very heavy in the fact that there are 2 tungsten beads, with that bead wire to make it ride hook up, sinks very quickly, even quicker than a clouser, but fishes like a clouser, but also doesn't get hung as often because the hook's up, and then the hook's up on a clouser as well.
That's true.
I think it's just the shape of the head and the belly's a little fatter. It tends to just kind of skate over those rocks. So those would be my 4 that I would try fishing the bottom.
If anybody's listening and they're like, well, I want to see these things, we'll post a picture to our Instagram just to show what these flies look like. If you're curious about them, or you're thinking, I want to go pick some of these up,
or order some.
Or order some.
Are you still doing orders?
I do. Yes, the short answer is yes.
Okay. I know it takes a lot of time, obviously.
It really does, and having, being a happily married man with a full-time teaching and an awesome 8-year-old and a 2.5-year-old at home, prioritizing life and time is a big deal. But I do not at the volume that I was.
Yeah.
And if I'm just being honest, when I first got into fly fishing, I needed something to fund the habit.
Sure.
There were rods I wanted to buy, gear I wanted to buy, and so tying flies was just a way for me to get the gear I needed to do what I love. And so going back to Dwayne again, he kind of jokingly said, "So what you're telling me is you're not as hungry as you used to be." And so I do still tie.
I'm going to keep these out, and we'll take a picture at the end of all of them.
Individuals here and there will ask, and I'm happy to do some small batch stuff.
Yeah.
I do tie the creek crawlers for the Woodsman in Fort Smith.
Oh, cool.
And the Natural State Fly Shop in Cotter. I don't get either of those shops the volume that they would like to, but they're both very cool in whatever I can, whenever I can. So when I'm out for summer vacation, I have a little more time to tie, and I'll tie up a few dozen and try to get them to them.
So what you're saying is you do still do some orders, not as much, but if you're listening, if you can be the first one,
that's it. That's
you got to get in line, and if you can jump on it right now, you could jump in quick and get an order in.
That's it. I started having to tell people it's like a 3 to 4 week turnaround, and sometimes it's a week or two, but it just really depends on what all I have going on.
Yeah.
So, So
got it.
So that's bottom flies.
Okay, let's work to middle of the water column.
Middle column. So this moving to some craft fur. Is a craft fur bait fish, and it is keel weighted as well. Well, I guess I don't know if you would call it keel weighted. I've heard people refer to keel weight as making it ride hook up, and keel weight as making it ride hook down. So I don't want to speak on what, but I'm just basically taking some lead wrap and wrapping it around the lower bend of the hook to make it ride hook down, but it still sinks very slowly. And so, the longer you wait, it would make its way down to the bottom, but this one's going to go, if you fish it on a floating line, it's just going to sink about this slow right here. And sometimes, especially if you fish these like near grass beds or anywhere that the minnows are schooled up and you throw this in the middle of them, it allows you to work the fly, but also just let it sit and do its thing. And that craft fur is just beautiful. And I try to tie all of my flies with material that is all of similar diameter, right? What I was told is when you throw a fly in the water, you don't want that fly to go in all different directions.
Right.
When you throw it in the water, you want materials that are going to flow together, stay together to make it look more realistic. So I'm using ice dubbing for the flash and copper. Copper is my go-to color for the Ozarks for flash. And I don't like a lot of flash.
Yeah.
And there are two theories there. I've seen some guys fish some super flashy flies, but I like to do an olive and white or a dark brown light tan. But in every fly that I tie, copper is my color flash, and that's because those shiners, a lot of those shiners, if you look at them in the water or the stone rollers, like some of them look like they have a little copper stripe in them.
Looks
more
like
the shiners, not so much
to me sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm going to go with either that or this is where the double deceiver comes in. That's another fly that I like to have in my box.
Yep.
And just simple and easy. I went on a trip this past weekend, went through several flies throughout the day, and at the end of the day ended up catching a 17-inch smallmouth this shad-colored double deceiver.
Yeah.
So I keep those in a yellow and brown, an olive and white, and then this shad gray and white.
Okay.
But that would be another middle of the column. It's not going to sink at all unless you use a sinking line. You can keel weight the back hook.
Okay.
To help it it's not so much, I guess, about getting it down quicker. It will do that, but it just helps it swim correctly. And then when you strip it, that tail, it kind of gives it a little kick to it.
Okay, got it.
So I wouldn't recommend fishing that fly completely unweighted or without a sinking line, unless you're wanting something that kind of skirts across the top.
Yeah. You need a little bit of weight to get that down to the middle to bottom of the
That's it.
mid water column.
And that one sort of serves the same purpose as my other preference is going to be the feather game changer. And I'll tie them in white, black, olive, and tan, and I have them in my box in all of those colors, just because some days I want to fish visual and I like to watch the white streamer going through the water. The fish like it. I'll put a little bit of pearl flash in there so it still imitates the bait fish. But in some of the super clear waters, these olive with copper flash and the black, something about the black really does well in all water types, in dirty water and clear water. But I would say the black game changer and the white game changer are my two top colors.
Okay.
So those are the ones I'm going to fish, or the double deceiver. Now I have taken that keel weighted craft fur bait fish and fished it on a sinking line as well, and they're all, in my opinion, sort of covering the same scenario.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And if you want to get deeper in the water column, use a sinking line or a sink tip line. If you want to just get right under the water surface, using an intermediate line. But those kind of interchangeable for where I'd fish them. It's just a matter of which line I would fish them with.
Got it.
Yep.
Got it. When it comes to those and you're fishing the middle of the water column, how are you kind of breaking apart the water the same way you were talking about with the pie and working your way from the head to the tail of the pool? Starting close, going out further, and kind of working your way down?
I think probably I'm guilty with streamer fishing of just throwing it right to the good stuff.
Sure.
Getting it. I do still work in a pie shape, and that's just so that I have I can look at this rock and know, okay, I casted that rock and I fished this line. And okay, now I'm going to fish to that log. So that's just my reference point to make sure that I've covered all the water.
Yeah.
But when I streamer fish, typically I'm in a boat, in a raft, or in a kayak or a canoe. And in that instance, I'm in the middle or 15, 20 feet or 10 feet off the bank. So I'm just casting to the bank, to the structure, retrieving back to the boat, letting it drop down. Now, if we're not catching them, then I will switch to the bank behind me to see, on a trip I was on this weekend, we were fishing and the beautiful shaded side with all the structure wasn't producing. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, I'll just give it a shot. And so I turned my back and fished the bank that was in shallow with no cover in the hot sunshine. But there were bass over there cruising in the shallows for minnows, and started catching them. So,
how about that?
We box ourselves in sometimes.
Yeah,
and I really, my method is almost no method at all. The method is try everything.
Explore.
And whatever's working for those minutes of that day, fish that. And if it's not, change it up a little bit. And what works, obviously, in the morning may or may not work throughout the day. There's a science to that, and I haven't fully cracked the code enough that I would want to speak on it. But just trial and error and keep hammering.
Love it.
Yeah.
All right, top of the water.
Top water is...
We are rapidly, if you're watching, we are rapidly losing light.
We are, for sure.
I was going to fly through top water and then wrap her up.
Top water for me is just going to be... literally a popper. Like I might do a topwater popper, or right now we got the cicada hatch going on. I did not tie this cicada. Brandon Bales did. Panther Branch Bugs, if you follow him on Instagram, phenomenal deer hair tire.
I do follow him.
He tied this cicada. And it's not even to match the current hatch. Obviously that one's just black and green. It's not the black and orange like we're seeing right now.
This would be like the annuals, right?
But I'm just using like a boogle bug, or this is a little bass popper that Mac Wilson tied and gave to me.
Okay.
I don't tie as much top water because I have good buddies that have given me bugs they tied, or the boogle bug is just hard to beat. But I have kind of gotten into deer hair as well. like Dahlberg divers and sliders and stuff. Since meeting Brandon has sort of inspired me to try my hand at deer hair.
Those are intense,
so
man.
poppers or deer hair bugs, frogs, things like that. Or something that's really cool is a howitzer popper head tied like on a feather game changer body. So like a howitzer topwater changer.
Whoa.
They
inventive.
look big and aggressive, and that came from Evan Smedley. If you've ever seen the Washita Fly Anglers guys on Instagram, Evan definitely, I would say, is one of the guys, was the first one to get me in a boat throwing streamers.
Okay.
And so he's the one who turned me on to the howitzer and kind of the game changer. And I don't want to box him in because he invents a lot of his own flies that he uses to tie. But again, it just goes back to whoever will teach me things, I'm here to learn it and try it, and maybe I'll make it my own, or maybe I'll do exactly what they've done.
Yeah.
You know?
Heck
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
And for you, when you're throwing top water, if you had to, I know you're saying, you adapt and you change, but what's your typical go-to kind of technique when it comes to fishing top water? Are you casting it out and popping it in straight away, or how do you fish?
So if I'm trying to imitate a topwater minnow, it doesn't get to sit at all.
Okay.
The moment that it hits the water, or if I'm fishing, like the howitzer changer where it's supposed to be a bait fish at the top, as quickly as it hits, I'm ripping it out of there at a high rate of speed with some pauses, like strip pause. But if I'm fishing like a popper or a boogle bug or like a Mr. Wiggly, I think it's called, those are throw it and leave it, and count to 5 or count to 10 and maybe twitch it occasionally. But with the howitzer and the topwater minnow, you're wanting to throw it to the bank. You have to strip mend, which was something I learned about from Evan, because you don't want to get a belly in your line. So it's like as you strip, you're lifting and mending to keep connection with the fly and keep it looking natural. So popper is going to be more of a stationary, let it sit and do it. Something that I learn a lot from YouTube videos. I think a lot of us do these days. But Chad Johnson watched one of his videos, and something he talked about is not letting yourself get into a routine that you stay in. When you fish all day long, you get into the strip, pause, strip, pause, strip, pause. Or even if you're trying to switch it up, strip, pause, strip, pause. So, it's really like hunt the fly, think about whatever that thing is that you're imitating with your streamer, and don't do the same pattern. Like make yourself... Maybe do some short 2-inch, 3-inch strips, or maybe do a long. Sometimes I'll just do a whole foot to 16 inches of just pulling it and then pause. And I get a lot of hits on the streamer fishing on the pause. Getting them following, but it's on the pause where they come up to inspect and grab it. So it just would be different. Top water just depends on what fly you're fishing in the scenario. But there's something to be said when you're fishing a topwater minnow for getting it away from the fish before they have a chance to realize that it's not a real fish. Put it in front of them and then get it out of there.
Get it moving.
And trigger that strike.
Yeah.